Think your weekly grocery bill is brutal? Try surviving the Middle Ages on boiled roots, moldy bread, and something called gruel, served cold. While kings feasted, peasants clung to life with meals so basic, they make instant noodles look gourmet. But here's the twist. These 15 medieval meals didn't just fill bellies. They fueled empires, plagues, and revolts. And by the end of this video, you'll realize survival wasn't about flavor. It was about anything that wouldn't kill you. Before there were cookbooks, calorie counts, or what's for dinner texts, there was pottage, the medieval answer to everything from hunger to hardship. This thick, slow, simmered stew wasn't just food. It was survival in a pot. Pottage wasn't a dish. It was a lifestyle, a meal that never truly ended. Pottage was the medieval peasant's version of a slow cooker that ran non-stop. In most homes, the cooking pot rarely left the hearth. New ingredients were added daily as others were scooped out. It was the never-ending stew, always changing, yet always the same. In a word, everything and sometimes almost nothing. At its base, pottage consisted of whatever grain was cheapest and available. Barley, oats, or rye. These were boiled into a thick, porridge-like consistency, forming the hearty foundation. From there, peasants added any vegetables they could grow, forage, or trade. Turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage. Occasionally, if the gods were kind, peas or carrots. According to archaeological studies, the average peasant household kept their pottage going for at least 4 days, with some stretching it through the harshest winter months. In bad times, the ingredients dwindled down to little more than grain and root vegetables, over and over again. Did pottage ever get fancy? Rarely, but sometimes it got hopeful. If a family managed to trap a rabbit, barter for bacon, or receive scraps from a noble's feast, they might drop in a piece of salt pork or fatback, not to eat it directly, but to let the fat rise to the top, infusing the whole pot with priceless calories. And for seasoning, forget exotic spices. Peasants relied on what grew near their huts: parsley, sage, wild garlic, and nettle. It wasn't gourmet, but it was nourishment. Interestingly, all classes ate pottage. But don't be fooled. Noble pottage and peasant pottage were two different species. Nobles added imported spices, rare vegetables, meat, even wine. Peasants made do with what the land offered, and often what others threw away. Some historians estimate that peasants consumed 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily. That's right, this humble stew powered the medieval workforce, the very foundation of feudal agriculture and serfdom. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't flavorful. It certainly wasn't social media ready, but pottage kept people alive through famine, war, plague, and endless labor. In a world where food wasn't a pleasure but a battle, pottage was the frontline defense. And though it might seem unappetizing to modern eyes, in the Middle Ages, it was the closest thing to comfort food most people ever had. Today, we romanticize bread, artisanal sourdough, golden baguettes, and fluffy white loaves line our bakeries. But for the medieval peasant, bread was neither pretty nor soft, and it could kill you. Welcome to the world of dense, dark, and sometimes deadly bread. Medieval bread reflected your place in society. The rich ate wheat, the poor, rye, barley, and anything that could be ground into flour. Wheat grew poorly in Northern Europe's cold, wet soil. Rye and barley, by contrast, thrived in marginal land, perfect for peasants. But there was a cost: taste, texture, and sometimes sanity. Think baking was wholesome? Think again. Peasants had to pay to grind their grain at the Lord's mill, often leaving them with less flour than they started with. To stretch what they had, they added fillers: beans, peas, acorns, and in truly desperate times, tree bark or straw. The result was a dark, heavy loaf, often as hard as the lives of those who baked it. Don't imagine daily fresh bread with butter and jam. Most peasants didn't own ovens. Instead, villages had communal ovens, fired up once per week. Bread baked in large batches, and each day it got staler, harder, and increasingly inedible without help. That's where pottage or ale came in. By week's end, soaking bread was the only way to chew it. And then there was the fungus. Rye bread, the staple of the peasant diet, was particularly vulnerable to ergot fungus, a natural contaminant that, when consumed, caused hallucinations, convulsions, limb gangrene, and in large doses, death. Known as Saint Anthony's fire, ergot poisoning wiped out entire villages, often mistaken for divine punishment or witchcraft. Despite its dangers, bread was sacred. Stealing it could mean imprisonment or public shame. Wasting bread was considered a sin against God. Tax records list bread fines, and church sermons warned of eternal punishment for throwing out crusts. On average, a working man consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day, roughly 60% of his daily calories. Women and children ate slightly less, but bread was central to every meal. And this wasn't indulgence, it was survival. Bread filled stomachs and powered muscles. No matter how bitter or stale it became, it wasn't soft, it wasn't sweet, and sometimes it wasn't safe. But bread was life, a dark, dense loaf that held the medieval world together, one hard bite at a time. When pottage ran dry and bread was nothing but a distant memory, medieval peasants turned to their final fallback, gruel. It wasn't delicious, it wasn't filling, but when you had nothing, gruel was everything. What was gruel? In short, a few spoonfuls of grain boiled in a sea of water until it resembled a thin, sad soup.
No solte, no fete, no flavor.
Just warmth and a little hope. The recipe, if you can call it that, a handful of oats, barley, or millet scraps, a large pot of water. Boil until something vaguely edible floats to the top. Unlike pottage, which tried to be a meal, gruel was just survival. In monasteries, gruel became more than necessity, it was virtue. Medieval monks consumed gruel as part of religious fasting, twice a day during Lent, with honey or dried fruit if lucky, without protest because hardship was holy. Monastery records show monks consumed over 3,000 pounds of dried oats per year, much of it boiled into this thin broth of penance. Too sick to chew bread? Too weak for pottage? Gruel was the original medieval foredrip, a way to keep the dying alive or at least delay death. Recommended for fevers, toothaches, and melancholy. Given to babies weaning from milk. Prescribed in medical texts as a carrier for herbs or wine. But in the villages, it was rarely this gentle. Gruel meant you had nothing left. Court records from medieval England tell a darker truth. Many children who died during famines had one thing in common. They were fed gruel and nothing else. Gruel lacked protein. No fat, no vitamins, no hope. Families stretched it as far as they could, but some kids never stood a chance. One medieval writer put it bluntly, even the dogs turned from it unless truly starving. It wasn't hyperbole. Gruel was watered, down to spare, spooned out day after day until the crisis passed. Or didn't. Modern nutritionists estimate that medieval gruel, barely 50 to 100 calories per bowl, was enough to trick the stomach but starve the body. And yet, for millions across Europe, it kept hope alive. Final line. No one celebrated gruel. No bard sang songs about it. But when nothing else remained, this thin lifeline of hot water and grain became the last defense between hunger and the grave. Forget kale, quinoa, or whatever's trending on health blogs this week. If you were a medieval peasant, your life may have literally depended on one humble, lumpy, dirt-covered hero. The turnip. Why did turnips matter so much? Because they were almost impossible to kill, grew in poor soil, survived with minimal care, had a short growing season, could be planted late, harvested late, forgave neglect like a saint. One single turnip seed could yield up to 15 pounds of food, a productivity rate that would make modern farmers weep with envy. When time, energy, and ingredients were scarce, turnip stew was the go-to meal. The recipe? Simple. Chop turnips. Add water. Boil until soft. Maybe salt if you were lucky.
No herbs, no garnished, no joy.
Just warm calories and the dull comfort of not dying. Long before refrigeration, peasants needed crops that could sit through brutal winters. Turnips delivered, stored in cool, dry cellars. Some villages dug turnip pits, underground bunkers lined with straw. Could stay edible for months, feeding entire families through late spring. The best part? You didn't just eat the root. Leaves, tossed into pottage. Flowers, eaten like greens in spring. Even peelings, fed to pigs or used in compost. In a world where waste meant starvation, turnips were the ultimate no-waste vegetable. Folk healers swore by turnips too. Turnip juice for coughs, poultices for skin problems. Some texts even claimed turnips could drive away winter melancholy, which was probably medieval speak for not being scurvy-ridden and miserable. Let's not romanticize it. Turnip stew wasn't exactly fine dining. Reheated turnips developed a funk. Medieval writers complained about the smell permeating homes. And yes, flavor fatigue was real. One monk wrote that peasants eat turnips until their skin takes on the power of the root itself. Whatever that means, it's probably not flattering. In times of war, plague, or famine, this lowly root vegetable stood tall. Whether in pottage, stew, or straight from the pit, turnips fed generations when nothing else could. So next time you see one in the grocery store, give it a nod. It may be bland, but once upon a time, it saved Europe. If you think broccoli and blue cheese are a divisive flavor combo, let's rewind 800 years and meet the real dream team of medieval cooking. Cabbage and onion, the peasant's answer to how do I make this gruel slightly less depressing. In the medieval world, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable, it was practically a miracle machine. One head could grow as big as 15 pounds. Outer leaves could be harvested as the plant kept growing. Regenerative food? Yes, centuries before TikTok trends. Old manorial garden records showed that 10 cabbage plants could feed a family for months. Fresh cabbage lasted for weeks in cool storage. But medieval folks didn't stop there. They embraced the power of fermentation, giving rise to the mighty sauerkraut. Yes, spelled like that in ye old times. Entire cabbage pits were dug to store and sour the vegetable for months. Archaeologists uncovered pits containing remnants of over 100 cabbages, a winter supply for an entire village. If cabbage was the bulky backbone of peasant meals, onions were the flavor assassin. Grew in terrible soil, needed barely any care, repelled insects when planted near other crops. Bonus points. When stored in a dry spot, onions could last all winter, providing that sharp flavor boost to otherwise tasteless meals. Of course, with flavor came consequences. Yes, lots of it. Medieval flatulence was no joke. Some monasteries banned cabbage dishes on days when guests were expected, an early form of air quality control. Here's the irony. While peasants ate cabbage and onion daily, the upper class warned against them. Medieval medical texts claimed these low vegetables made people melancholic, dull, slothful in mind. In short, noble physicians were anti-cabbage. Yet the peasants eating these humble greens were often healthier than their meat, gorging lords, especially when famine hit. Cabbage and onions were so valued that tax records show them used as currency. 2 heads of cabbage and a sack of onions could settle a small debt. In a cash-poor society, edible assets were serious business. Alone, cabbage and onion could test the limits of your nose and stomach. Together, they formed the pungent power duo of peasant survival, cheap, resilient, and just flavorful enough to make another bowl of pottage feel like a proper meal. Whether boiled, soured, stewed, or just stuffed into bread to make it chewable again, they flavored centuries of survival. So next time your kitchen reeks of brassica and onion, smile. You're cooking like a medieval survivor. In a world where protein was scarcer than clean water, peasants didn't have beef jerky or boiled eggs. They had peas and beans, the humble legume legends of the medieval food chain. While nobles gnawed on venison haunches, the working class survived on mushed pulses and called it dinner. And honestly, it worked. Dried peas packed nearly 25% protein by weight, a nutritional miracle when meat was reserved for feast days or famine gods. In fasting seasons, when meat was banned for more than half the year, thanks, church, these little guys became life-saving staples. A single bowl of mashed peas with bread delivered enough fuel for 12-hour field shifts, and they were cheap, long-lasting, easy to grow, easy to store, and yes, easy to digest, until they weren't. Here's the genius. Peas and beans didn't just feed people, they repaired the land. nitrogen fixers before the term even existed. After wheat drained the soil, legumes restored it naturally. Peasants planted them between crops, after harvest, in bad soil. Basically, crop rotation's MVP. Monks loved legumes. In fact, monastic kitchens ran on them. One abbey fed 40 monks using 3,000 pounds of dried peas per year. That's 75 pounds per monk, aka Lent's version of a protein bar. Peas and beans were also easy to soak, mash and flavor with garlic, wild herbs, or even a touch of fat if available. Peasants dried legumes in the sun or hung them in bundles indoors. No refrigeration needed. A stash of dried peas could last for years if stored in pottery jars or wooden barrels. Archaeologists once found 10-year-old dried peas still technically edible. Not tasty, but edible. Medieval diet guides actually warned, consume not of beans before the court or service. Translation: don't eat beans before public appearances unless you want to get banned from polite society. When bread was gone and meat was a memory, peas and beans were the warm, mushy barrier between hunger and collapse. They weren't glamorous, but they rebuilt bodies, replenished soil, and most importantly, kept the feudal economy standing. So next time you toss lentils in your stew, know this: you're continuing a 1,000-year tradition of cheap protein and stubborn hope. When medieval peasants got meat, they didn't carve steaks or savor drumsticks. They got the rest. The parts most people today won't touch, the organs, feet, heads, lungs, and blood, were once considered a treasure trove of nutrition. Welcome to the original nose to tail lifestyle. Medieval offal. In the peasant economy, slaughter day wasn't just about meat, it was a rare chance for protein. Workers who helped the butchering often received the head, the feet, the pluck, heart, liver, lungs. And they used everything. Cheeks were tender and prized. Ears were fried crispy like medieval pork rinds. Snout and lips turned into jelly. Brain scrambled like eggs, if you didn't mind forgetting your name after. Blood pudding wasn't a Victorian invention, it was a peasant survival food. Take animal blood, mix with grain, usually oats, herbs, onion if lucky, and stuff it in intestines. Then boil. Voila! A calorie-packed, iron-rich dish you could eat hot or cold. Got a cow's stomach? Stuff it with barley, liver bits, and herbs equals proto-haggis. Sheep lungs? Slice thin, fry with onions. Quick peasant lunch. Peasants weren't squeamish. They couldn't afford to be. Every part of the animal had value. Bones, boiled for marrow. Fat, rendered into lard. Skin, dried, sometimes eaten. Intestines, cleaned and reused as sausage casing. Medieval cookbooks had entire sections for lesser meats. These were prized not for flavor, but fuel. Don't let the word scraps fool you. Offal was so important, court records show people fined or jailed for stealing sheep lungs or pig intestines. One man in 14th century Kent was fined 2 weeks' wages for stealing a pig's pluck. Offal spoiled quickly, no fridges, remember? Most dishes were made same day, right after slaughter. But that didn't stop them from becoming feast day favorites. Liver pies, tripe stews, kidneys with wild garlic. Modern chefs call it nose to tail. Medieval peasants just called it Tuesday. They knew every bit of the animal mattered. Every organ was energy, every drop of blood nutrition, and every bite survival. So the next time you pass on liver, remember, it once fed entire families, kept communities alive, and was considered worth stealing. Before the drive-through, before ramen noodles, before just add water cup meals, there was salted herring. Salty. Portable. No cooking needed. In the harsh world of the Middle Ages, this humble fish was the meal that fed a continent. Salted herring wasn't just a food, it was an industry. Caught in the North Sea by the millions. Salted on boats immediately after catch. Barrels packed to the brim, then shipped across Europe. During peak seasons, ports like Great Yarmouth hauled in up to 40 million fish in weeks. That's not a seafood market, that's a national survival strategy. Religious rules made meat off limits for half the year. Fridays, Lent, Advent. Over 150 no-meat days. What could you eat? Fish. And herring was cheap, available, and Catholic approved. One monastery in York recorded eating over 15,000 herring per year for just 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk. Holy omega-3s. Before refrigerators, food preservation was a matter of life or death. Herring's secret? Salt. Lots of it. Gutted, packed in salt within minutes. Stored in barrels for months or years. Eaten straight from the cask, no heat required. Cheap herring was white, just salted. Premium herring was red, salted, then smoked until leathery and shelf, stable. Why was herring so beloved by peasants? Didn't spoil like meat, could be eaten cold, packed with protein and fat, saved fuel, time, and teeth. Paired with stale bread and ale, salted herring was the perfect energy boost for a long day in the fields. Of course, there were downsides. The smell was legendary. Processing districts were downwind for a reason. Repeated meals led to serious palate fatigue. But when you're starving, salty fish is a blessing, not a burden. With grain stores running low and root cellars empty, salted herring kept people alive. Even far from the coast, trade routes brought barrels to mountain villages and inland towns. Tax records show barrels moving hundreds of miles, traded like gold. Herring became so crucial it shaped trade alliances, wars, and even church politics. The Hanseatic League was partly built on herring commerce. Kings taxed it. Monasteries depended on it. Peasants prayed for it. Salted herring may not win any Michelin stars, but in the medieval world, it was the original fast food.
No prep, no fast.
Just salt, fish, and survival. So next time you complain about leftovers, remember, a medieval peasant would have fought for a barrel of herring. If you think medieval peasants drank ale because they loved a good buzz, think again. They drank ale because water could literally kill them. And no, we're not being dramatic. Medieval water sources were less than ideal. Wells dug next to outhouses, rivers that doubled as sewers, contaminated runoff from nearby livestock pens. No one knew what bacteria were, but they knew something. Drink from the wrong place, and you'd be dead before dinner. The miracle? Brewing. Boiling water to make ale killed off most of the dangerous microbes. Fermentation added a touch of alcohol, enough to prevent recontamination. In short, ale was medieval filtration, brewed with boiled water, 1 to 3% alcohol, small ale, drunk by everyone, men, women, and yes, children. Small ale wasn't just safe, it was caloric. In a time when every calorie mattered, ale pulled double duty. Hydration, nutrition, energy boost for field work. Some records suggest adult laborers drank up to a gallon per day. That's 8 pints, not for partying, but for plowing. In most villages, brewing was a domestic chore, like baking or mending. Peasant women brewed weekly, ale stored in jugs, barrels, or leather flasks. Brewing days were social events and sometimes business opportunities. Alewives sold their brews at markets or roadside stands, forming the first female-led food economy. Ale wasn't just food, it was wages, incentive, and tax payment. Monks received daily ale rations. Laborers were paid in ale and bread. Rat catchers, bell ringers, even road crews earned gallons per week. Ale and bread were medieval besties. Why? Both used yeast. Both used grains. Brewing day often equals baking day. Leftover ale fermented the next batch of bread. Old crusts could start fermentation in new ale. Nothing went to waste. Everything worked together. While small ale was everyday fare, stronger ale, up to 6 to 8% alcohol, was saved for weddings, harvest celebrations, major holidays, funeral toasts. Yes, medieval Irish wakes were a thing. Some estates even brewed mead or cider for special occasions, but ale remained the unquestioned king of daily drink. In a world where disease lurked in every drop of water, ale wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. So the next time someone says, medieval people drank ale with every meal, you can answer, yes, because the alternative was dysentery. So you've been drinking gallons of weak ale all week. Your bread is rock hard. Your stew is 90% cabbage. And then, something miraculous happens. A drink that's not bitter, flat, or suspiciously murky. The sweet, it's golden. The cider, or even rarer, mead. Medieval cider wasn't just a treat, it was a strategic move. Apple trees grew on land too steep or rocky for other crops. Once planted, they produced fruit for decades. Apples stored poorly, but fermented cider lasted all winter. Making cider didn't require special tools. Crush apples with stones or wooden presses. Let the juice ferment naturally. Bottle, barrel, or drink on the spot. Strong batches reached 8% alcohol, but most medieval cider was closer to 3 to 5%. Just enough to feel warm and forget about your turnip dinner. If cider was a peasant victory, then mead was a holy grail. Made by fermenting honey and water, mead was the oldest alcoholic drink in Europe. But there was a catch. Honey was ridiculously expensive. Wild honey required smoking out bees and risking stings. Beekeeping was rare and time-consuming. Most peasants tasted mead maybe twice a year at weddings or Christmas. For those lucky enough to own a hive or know someone who did, mead was worth its weight in gold. It was sweet when most diets were painfully bland. It was stronger than cider or ale, and it lasted years in cool cellars. In short, mead was magic in a mug. Let's talk strategy. Fermentation wasn't just about alcohol, it was about preservation. Cider preserved the sugar and vitamins of apples. Mead preserved honey, which otherwise spoiled or crystallized. Both drinks delivered calories plus morale during the brutal winter months. Because sugar was an imported luxury, cider and mead were the only sweet things peasants could realistically make. They were gifts to landlords, bartered at market, saved for religious feasts or special visitors. One village record lists 2 bottles of cider and a goose as payment for a midwife. Another mentions a young couple receiving a single cup of mead as a wedding gift, more valuable than livestock in some places. Like many things in the Middle Ages, cider and mead weren't just food, they were medicine. Cider was prescribed for fevers and melancholy. Mead was mixed with herbs for coughs, wounds, digestion, and childbirth recovery. Monastic brewers doubled as local healers, offering fortified mead as tonics. Let's be honest, getting tipsy probably helped with the placebo effect. During festivals and feast days, community barrels of cider were tapped, often brewed collectively. Villagers shared stories, sang songs, and yes, got mildly drunk together. Cider and mead weren't just sweet drinks, they were storage systems,
Moral boosters.
social connectors, and in some ways, medieval antidepressants. So the next time you sip something bubbly and sweet, raise a glass to the peasants who fermented joy in the darkest times. If you're a medieval peasant with a sweet tooth, you're out of luck. There's no chocolate, no sugar, no cake. But there's honey if you're brave, and there are berries if you're quick. Because in the world of medieval peasant food, sweetness wasn't pleasure. It was survival, celebration, and sometimes currency. Forget gold coins. The real treasure was honey, thick, sticky, and painfully hard to come by. Medieval honey was one of the few natural sweeteners available to peasants. But unlike apples, you couldn't just pick it from a tree, you had to steal it from thousands of angry bees. Wild foraging for honey was dangerous business. Climbs up trees, smoke to calm the hive, gloves made of leather or pure hope. Beehives, if you were lucky enough to own one, became family heirlooms. Some wills from the 1200s even listed them alongside land and livestock. Hives were built from hollow logs, clay pots, or woven straw skeps placed near flowering herbs or orchards. A well-managed hive produced 15 to 20 pounds of honey per year. And it wasn't just for food. Medieval medicine prized honey for coughs, wounds, and digestive issues. It was also used to preserve fruits, make mead, and even set hairstyles. Yes, medieval peasants had honey-based hair gel. Your 5-step routine just got medieval. If honey was rare, wild berries were the summer jackpot. Strawberries, blackberries, gooseberries, bilberries, and raspberries grew wild across Europe. No planting required, just keen eyes and quick hands. The catch? They were seasonal and perishable. Without sugar or refrigeration, berries were eaten fresh, straight from the bush, mashed into pottage or fermented into vinegar, or mixed with honey on rare feast days. If a peasant served you a berry honey tartlet, you were either a VIP guest, their betrothed, or they just won the medieval equivalent of the lottery. A perfect berry harvest and leftover honey. Berries and honey were offered to the sick, saved for children, used in religious rituals during feast days. One record from 13th century England describes berry juice mixed with honey being painted on bread for church offerings, a kind of holy toast. Court records show theft of honey treated nearly as seriously as stealing a cow. Why? Because it had value far beyond taste. Honey stored for months or years could be traded or bartered, and in some areas used as rent payment. One village ledger records a family paying 1 pot of honey and 2 pints of cider as their annual dues. Delicious taxes. For most peasants, sweets weren't an everyday indulgence. They were a few days a year, if that. Children grew up without ever tasting sugar. Adults remembered one honey meal from their wedding day. Berries? Only if you beat the birds to them. In a world without sugar, sweetness was sacred. Medieval honey and wild berries offered more than flavor. They were reminders of nature's generosity, rare pleasures in a life of hard labor. And the medieval peasants' only dessert that didn't involve tree bark. When grain failed and gardens froze, peasants didn't panic. They listened for squirrels. Because when all else failed, the medieval diet turned to the trees. Welcome to the world of nuts and acorns, the original emergency pantry of the forest, where even bark became bread and squirrels became survival mentors. If you lived in parts of France, Italy, or Spain, you didn't call chestnuts a snack. You called them dinner. Chestnut trees were nicknamed the bread tree. In some regions, chestnuts made up 20% of winter calories. One tree could yield 200 pounds of chestnuts, enough to feed a family for weeks. Preparation methods: roasted in embers for warmth and flavor, boiled to make soft mash or added to pottage, dried and ground into chestnut flour, ideal for bread, stretching during grain shortages. In fact, entire tax assessments in some medieval villages included 3 goats, 1 acre, and for chestnut trees. That's right, chestnuts were wealth. Acorns weren't easy food. They were labor-intensive desperation food. Raw acorns contain tannins, a bitter compound that can make you sick. Medieval peasants knew they had to soak and leach acorns to detoxify them. This meant crushing, soaking in streams, changing water, and waiting days. Once cleaned, acorns were dried, ground into meal, and mixed with other flours. Result: dark, dense, bitter bread, often cooked as ash cakes. Not gourmet, but not starving. Acorn meal was survival food during famines, especially in the 1315 to 1317 Great Famine, where even church records mention mass gathering events in oak groves. The forest was technically owned by the Lord, but foraging was often allowed during hard times. Gleaning rights were part of peasant law, rights to gather fallen wood, nuts, and food. Court records from the 14th century show fights over acorn, gathering rights during bad harvests. Entire families, especially women and children, would spend days collecting nuts in autumn. Stored right, both chestnuts and acorns could last for years. Some peasants buried chestnuts in sand and clay, lined pits. Acorns were kept dry in sealed barrels, ready for grinding in lean times. Modern diets ignore tree nuts unless they're honey, roasted, or in granola. But for medieval peasants, chestnuts and acorns were vital backup food, simple, sustainable, and silent saviors. So yes, while we mock squirrels for hoarding, medieval peasants took notes. Because when winter came and fields gave nothing, the trees kept giving. When medieval cupboards were bare and the last turnip had gone mushy, survival moved outdoors. Fields, forests, and roadside ditches became the grocery aisles of the desperate and the knowledgeable. But for every edible leaf or mushroom, there lurked a dangerous imposter. Welcome to medieval foraging. Equal parts skill, flavor, and fear. Spring was salvation. After months of eating dried grains, salted meat, if lucky, and old root vegetables, peasants looked for fresh green things. Nettles, stinging but nutrient, rich, boiled into soups or added to pottage. Sorrel, dandelion greens, chickweed, and wild garlic, packed with vitamins, especially vitamin C, preventing scurvy. Lamb's quarters, the medieval kale, nutrient, dense and abundant. These greens weren't side dishes. They were medicine, flavor, and filler all at once. Medieval peasants didn't have field guides or fungi Facebook groups. They relied on oral tradition, instinct, and the memory of who died last time. Chanterelles, morels, and porcini were prized by those who knew what to look for. Death caps, destroying angels, and other lookalikes were a constant threat. Court records from famine years include chilling entries like, "The family of John Tanner died after consuming woodland fungus, gathered near the mill path." Knowledge was life. In some villages, skilled foragers, often older women, were paid in food or favors to guide gathering. The forest was both pantry and peril. Peasants foraged under the Lord's permission, or sometimes without it. Legal gleaning rights allowed collection of wild herbs, berries, and greens. Special permits were sometimes issued in times of famine. In well-documented areas like Yorkshire and Normandy, villagers survived harsh winters by supplementing 30% or more of their diets with wild plants. How did they know what was safe? Generational knowledge, taught by mothers, grandmothers, village-wise women. Rules of thumb. If it smells of garlic, it's likely wild garlic. Rituals. Some plants gathered only on holy days or at dawn for best strength. Still, mistakes were made. Mushroom poisonings and plant misidentification appear in medieval death records. Despite the risk, foraging was non-negotiable, a key supplement to diets already stretched thin. Wild greens weren't just survival, they were flavor enhancers. Garlic mustard, wild onions, fennel, and ramps brought intensity to pottage. Even bitter greens were boiled, salted, and served with a rare spoon of lard or ale. Rose hips and hawthorn berries added tartness or were dried for medicine. The line between medicine and meal blurred here. To the medieval peasant, food was fuel, flavor, and folk cure in one.
Modern foraging is on each trend.
In the Middle Ages, it was the difference between eating and not. Peasants weren't wandering aimlessly. They followed seasonal rhythms, geographic memory, and communal tradition. So next time you pass by a patch of nettles or mushrooms in the woods, remember, one was soup, the other was a eulogy. When even the rats had vanished, and not a single turnip remained in the cellar, medieval peasants didn't give up. They went to the fire, and out of ashes and desperation, they made something astonishing. Ash cakes, primitive, gritty, and barely food by today's standards, but to them it was survival. Ash cakes were the last-ditch bread of the Middle Ages.
No flour, no oven.
No problem, just mix something starchy with water, and slap it into the ashes of your cooking fire.
No yeast, no salt.
No baking tools, just a flat disc of meal and grit, cooked directly in embers. Think of it as the pita bread of famine, minus everything that makes pita taste good. When real flour ran out, and it often did, peasants turned to anything that could be ground. Barley husks,
Triet peameal.
corn flour, tree bark, believe it or not, swept up grain dust from the corners of the granary. It wasn't tasty, it wasn't pretty, but it was food, barely. The method was as raw as it gets. Form the paste, flatten into a patty, toss it into hot ashes or lay it on a flat rock beside the fire. Flip once, eat, grit and all. Some peasants brushed the ashes off with a cloth. Others didn't bother. The result? A bitter, burnt, ash, dusted cracker with just enough calories to stay alive. Ash cakes didn't appear on medieval tables during good times. They were the food of sieges, famines, and failed harvests. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, ash cakes are mentioned in chronicles from England to Italy. In some regions, people ground up straw, hay, even animal hides to stretch the mixture. One account mentions ash cakes made with dust swept from the feet of the miller. Ash cakes weren't just food, they were a symbol. When all else failed, the fire still gave something back. Let's be honest, ash cakes were basically caloric placeholders. No protein, no fat, barely any vitamins. But when your choices were starve or eat wood and acorn patties seasoned with soot, you chose the cake. They required no storage, no rising, no equipment. That made them perfect for field workers, travelers, or people who had lost everything. Ash cakes are best when dropped in the mud first, so you don't notice the ash. Even the jokes were bleak, but they tell the truth. This wasn't peasant cuisine. It was peasant endurance. Ash cakes are what happen when humanity says, "We're not done yet." With nothing but a fire and a handful of desperation, medieval peasants baked survival into every gritty bite. If the phrase "clean out the fridge" had a medieval ancestor, this was it.
No recipe.
No rules, just whatever's edible, tossed together with hope and hot water. These were the whatever we have meals, the true heart of peasant cooking. And while they wouldn't win any awards, they kept entire villages alive. Every single day. In the medieval peasant kitchen, you didn't follow a recipe, you followed necessity. Leftover cabbage? In the pot. A crust of stale barley bread? Break it up, soak it in. One lonely onion? That's flavor gold. This wasn't just cooking, it was survival improvisation. Depending on the season, meals might include spring, wild greens, last winter's turnips, leftover peas. Summer, garden vegetables, stale bread, herbs from hedgerows. Fall, mushrooms, onions, nuts, cabbage. Winter, root veg, dried legumes, pickled leftovers from the cellar. Not taste, never taste. Most peasants didn't eat 3 meals a day. They ate once, maybe twice, and that meant the pot on the fire had to work overtime. Left to simmer for hours, covered in ash to keep warm, reheated every day until empty. This was slow food before it was trendy. Except it was slow because they had no choice. Some of Europe's greatest comfort foods began as whatever we have meals. Ratatouille, a Provençal dish made from late summer garden scraps. Ribollita, Italy's reheated peasant stew. Irish stew, a mix of root veg, broth, and whatever meat was found. Even pottage itself was a forever simmering improv dish. These dishes didn't start in royal kitchens. They started in cold cottages with empty shelves. Manorial tax rolls reveal these combinations. 3 turnips, half a cabbage, and 1 dried eel. A pail of soured ale and 2 barley loaves. Hard. These odd groupings likely reflected actual household inventory. Peasants gave what they had, even when what they had made no culinary sense. During feast days or weddings, peasants didn't magically get more food, they got more creative. That meant mixing in herbs they'd been saving, using the last piece of bacon fat for extra flavor, reheating the stew with 1 precious carrot to make it feel new. The best sauce is hunger. No truer words in the Middle Ages. Whatever was in the pot wasn't just food. It was the product of effort, planning, gathering, and resilience. These were the original zero waste meals. No branding,
No plating.
no delivery apps, just resourcefulness, heat, and a deep understanding of every scrap's value. If ash cakes were the last line of defense, then whatever we have meals were the daily front line of medieval survival. For peasants of the Middle Ages, food was never guaranteed. But every time they stirred the pot, they stirred in another day of life. So, the next time you grumble about your grocery bill, or roll your eyes at another night of leftovers, remember the people who survived on bark bread, sour cabbage, and cold gruel. These weren't gourmet meals. They were strategies crafted from desperation, endurance, and unshakable human will. Pottage simmered while babies were born. Turnips fed entire villages through snow-covered famine. And yes, salted herring and ale might not sound delicious, but they were the medieval equivalent of life insurance. These 15 humble meals weren't just food. They were the fuel behind plagues, pilgrimages, revolts, and revolutions. Behind every war banner was a pot of stew. Behind every cathedral, a field of barley. Behind every page of history was someone chewing on something they barely had the energy to grow. They ate what they had. They shared what they could. And somehow, generation after generation, they endured. Not because it was tasty, not because it was Instagrammable, but because they had no other choice. In the end, medieval peasants didn't feast to celebrate life. They feasted just to survive it.